In the vast tapestry of the galaxy, where 1,000 species bow to logic, efficiency, and calculated survival, there exists one race that defies every mathematical model of rational behavior. They are called humans, and they are considered by most civilized worlds to be either magnificently insane or dangerously unpredictable. I am HFY of the Keth Collective, a species renowned for our analytical minds and strategic thinking. For 3 centuries, I served as a military advisor to various galactic governments, always choosing the winning side, always calculating the optimal path to victory. I believed courage was simply another word for poor risk assessment. Then, I was assigned to observe a small human colony on the edge of nowhere, a place called Haven's Rest. I thought it would be another routine intelligence-gathering mission. I was wrong. What I witnessed there, in those final desperate hours when death seemed certain and hope had abandoned even the stars themselves, changed everything I thought I knew about bravery, sacrifice, and what it truly means to stand against impossible odds. This is the story of how a species I once dismissed as recklessly emotional taught me that sometimes the most logical thing you can do is choose to fight when winning is impossible, to hope when hope is gone, and to stand together when standing alone would be so much easier. This is the story of why, when the galaxy needed saving, it was humans who showed us all what courage really means. HFY adjusted the environmental controls of his observation pod as it drifted silently through the asteroid field surrounding Haven's Rest. The small human colony clung to a barren moon like a stubborn growth, its domed structures glowing softly against the harsh vacuum of space. According to his briefing, 12,000 humans called this desolate place home, having fled here after their homeworld fell to corporate raiders 3 decades ago. The Keth military advisor had seen dozens of such refugee settlements scattered across the outer rim. Most lasted 5 years before economics or desperation drove the inhabitants to surrender their independence to one of the major galactic powers. Haven's Rest had survived 30 years through a combination of luck, isolation, and what his superiors called typical human stubbornness. HFY's assignment was simple: observe and report. The Galactic Trade Consortium wanted to know if Haven's Rest possessed anything worth the cost of acquisition. His preliminary scan suggested the answer was no. The colony survived on asteroid mining, basic agriculture, and the occasional trade with smugglers. They had no strategic resources, no advanced technology, and no military worth mentioning. What they did have, HFY noted as he reviewed the colony's defensive capabilities, was a disturbing tendency to refuse reasonable surrender terms. His comm system chimed with an incoming transmission. The source was a battered cargo ship approaching the colony from the inner system. HFY activated his passive sensors and listened. Haven's Rest Control, this is Captain Maria Santos aboard the Independent Wanderer. We're carrying refugees from the Kepler Station incident. 300 souls need immediate medical attention and shelter. The response came quickly. Wanderer, this is Colony Administrator Chen. We copy your situation. Bay 3 is being cleared for emergency docking. Medical teams are standing by. HFY frowned. According to his intelligence files, Haven's Rest was already operating at maximum population capacity. Taking in 300 refugees would create severe resource shortages. The logical response would be to offer temporary aid while directing the refugees to a more suitable destination. Instead, the colony opened its doors without hesitation. Over the following days, HFY watched the human settlement transform itself to accommodate the newcomers. Families doubled up in housing units. Work shifts extended to 20-hour days. Food rations dropped across the board. Yet there were no protests, no demands that the refugees be sent elsewhere. The Keth observer found this behavior puzzling. His species approached such situations with careful calculation. Resources would be allocated based on contribution potential. Non-essential personnel would be relocated. The needs of the many would outweigh the needs of the few. Humans, it seemed, operated by different mathematics. Pod Commander HFY, his superior's voice crackled through the secure channel. What is your assessment of the target? The colony shows no signs of valuable resources, HFY reported. Population is now 15,300, well beyond sustainable levels for their infrastructure. I estimate social collapse within 6 months. Quote, understood. Continue observation. The consortium is interested in acquiring the settlement once it becomes desperate enough to accept reasonable terms. As weeks passed, HFY began to notice something unexpected. Despite the overcrowding and resource shortages, Haven's Rest was not collapsing. Instead, it was adapting. The refugee children were integrated into the colony's educational system. Adults found roles in mining operations, agriculture, and maintenance. The settlement's social fabric stretched but did not break. Zeftai found himself spending more time studying the humans and less time filing reports. Their behavior patterns defied every model of rational species development. They made decisions based on concepts like fairness and doing what's right, rather than optimal resource allocation. They formed emotional bonds with individuals outside their genetic lines and prioritized these relationships over personal advancement. It was inefficient, it was illogical, it was fascinating. 3 months into his observation, Zeftai's routine was interrupted by proximity alarms. A massive fleet was approaching Haven's Rest from the galactic core. His sensors identified the ships immediately: hegemony battle cruisers, the enforcement arm of the galaxy's most ruthless corporate empire. The Keth advisor quickly calculated the odds. The hegemony fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, 48 destroyers, and supporting vessels. Haven's Rest had 4 outdated defense platforms and a handful of converted cargo ships. The colony's total military capacity could not engage a single hegemony destroyer on equal terms. The math was simple. Surrender was the only rational choice. Zeftai opened a channel to Haven's Rest control, breaking his cover for the first time. His species universal translator rendered his words in standard human English. Haven's Rest, this is Keth military advisor Zeftai. I have been observing your colony on behalf of the Galactic Trade Consortium. A hegemony fleet is approaching your position. Surrender immediately and you may be permitted to relocate with minimal casualties. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. When Administrator Chen responded, his voice was steady. Advisor Zeftai, thank you for the warning. We're aware of the approaching fleet. Haven's Rest will not surrender. Administrator, you cannot possibly resist a force of that magnitude. Your defensive capabilities are insufficient. Surrender will save lives. Our lives aren't the only ones that matter, Chen replied. We have 300 refugees who fled hegemony occupation. They came to us for protection. We're not about to hand them back. Zeftai stared at his communication panel. The human was choosing certain death over a rational compromise. It made no sense. Administrator, the hegemony will take the refugees regardless of your resistance. Your sacrifice will accomplish nothing. Maybe not, Chen admitted. But at least we'll know we tried. At least those kids will know someone was willing to stand up for them, even if it didn't work out. The connection closed. Zeftai sat in his observation pod, processing what he had just heard. The humans were going to fight a battle they could not win to protect people who were not even members of their colony. They were choosing death over dishonor, sacrifice over survival. His analytical mind struggled to categorize such behavior. Was it courage or madness? Heroism or stupidity? Over the next 6 hours, he watched Haven's Rest prepare for war. The colonists worked with grim efficiency, converting civilian structures into defensive positions. Children were moved to the deepest shelters. The elderly volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a purpose. The refugees from Kepler Station were among the most active defenders. These were people who had already lost everything to the hegemony, who had every reason to accept defeat. Instead, they picked up weapons and took positions alongside their protectors. Zeftai found himself thinking of his own people. The Keth were survivors. They had endured for millennia by choosing the winning side, by calculating odds and making rational decisions. They were still alive because they were smart enough to know when they were beaten. But as he watched the humans prepare to make their final stand, the Keith advisor wondered if survival was worth having. If it came at the cost of everything that made life meaningful. The hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace right on schedule. Admiral Vexthor's voice boomed across all frequencies, as cold and precise as a mathematical equation. Colonial settlement Haven's Rest, you are in violation of hegemony territorial claims. Surrender immediately and prepare for boarding. Resistance will result in the total destruction of your facility. Administrator Chen's response was broadcast on the same frequency, ensuring that everyone in the system could hear it. This is Haven's Rest. We are a free colony, operating in neutral space. We do not recognize hegemony territorial claims, and we will not surrender our people to slavery. If you want this place, you'll have to take it. Zeftai activated his pod's recording systems. Whatever happened next, it deserved to be remembered. The hegemony fleet moved into attack formation with mechanical precision. 12 heavy cruisers, each one capable of reducing the colony to slag within minutes. The humans had positioned their 4 defense platforms to create overlapping fields of fire, but the gesture seemed almost pitiful against such overwhelming force. Then something unexpected happened. The cargo ships that had been docked at Haven's Rest began to move. Not away from the danger, as logic would dictate, but toward it. These were converted freighters armed with whatever weapons the colonists could cobble together. They formed a loose defensive line between the hegemony fleet and the colony. HFY counted them, 37 ships. Civilian vessels crewed by miners, traders, and refugees. They were flying directly into the teeth of a battle fleet that outgunned them by a factor of 10. It was magnificent. It was insane. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The first exchange of fire lit up the darkness like an artificial sun. Hegemony plasma beams lanched through space, each shot capable of vaporizing a city block. The human ships responded with everything they had. Mining lasers, missile pods salvaged from derelicts, and ancient projectile weapons that belonged in a museum. The battle was over in 20 minutes. It should have been over in 5. The humans fought like demons, using every trick, every advantage, every desperate gambit they could imagine. They rammed damaged ships into hegemony destroyers. They detonated their own reactors to take enemy vessels with them. They turned cargo containers into guided missiles and asteroid miners into improvised bombers. When it was over, the hegemony fleet had lost 8 destroyers and 2 cruisers. Half their remaining ships showed significant damage. It was the most effective resistance they had encountered in decades. It was also completely futile. Haven's Rest burned. The defense platforms were smoking ruins. Of the 37 civilian ships that had entered the battle, none survived intact. The colony's dome structures were cracked and venting atmosphere. Emergency lights flickered like dying stars. But they were not finished. As hegemony boarding craft approached the crippled colony, emergency broadcasts began transmitting on every frequency. These were not surrender offers or pleas for mercy. They were testimonials. "My name is Dr. Sarah Kim," came one voice. "I was born on Earth before the Exodus. I came to Haven's Rest to build something better, something free. Today I die fighting to protect that dream. Remember us." This is Chief Engineer Rodriguez. We held them for 23 minutes. That's 23 minutes more than they expected. Worth it. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, Colonial Defense Force. "Tell my kids I love them. Tell them their father died free." One by one, the voices faded to static. The hegemony had won, as everyone knew they would. The math had been simple from the beginning. But as HFY sat in his observation pod listening to those final transmissions, he realized that the humans had been calculating with different numbers all along. They had not been measuring victory in terms of ships destroyed or territory held. They had been measuring it in terms of dignity preserved, in promises kept, in the knowledge that they had stood for something worth dying for. For the first time in his 3 centuries of life, the Keith military advisor began to understand what courage actually meant. And he realized that everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness, about victory and defeat, had been wrong. HFY remained in his observation pod for 3 days after the battle, paralyzed by what he had witnessed. The hegemony occupation force had established control over Haven's Rest with ruthless efficiency. Surviving colonists were processed, catalogued, and prepared for transportation to labor camps across the empire. The refugees who had sparked the conflict were loaded onto prison ships bound for the mining worlds of the Outer Rim. According to every military manual HFY had studied, the humans had achieved nothing. Their colony was destroyed, their people enslaved, their resistance crushed. By any rational measure, their sacrifice had been pointless. Yet the Keith advisor found himself unable to file his final report. Something about the mathematics felt wrong. On the 4th day, his meditation was interrupted by an encrypted transmission on a frequency he didn't recognize. The signal was weak, heavily coded, and apparently originating from somewhere within the Haven's Rest system. "Unknown observer vessel, this is Resistance Cell 7. We know you're out there. We monitored your communications during the battle. If you can hear this, please respond." HFY stared at his communication panel. "Resistance cells?" According to hegemony reports, all significant opposition had been eliminated. His sensors showed no active human vessels in the system. Curiosity overcame caution. He opened a return channel. "This is Keth Military Advisor HFY. Who am I speaking to?" "Captain Lisa Park, formerly of the Colonial Defense Force. Currently operating from undisclosed locations. We need to talk." "Captain Park, according to my information, you should be dead or captured. The hegemony secured complete control of your system." "The hegemony secured complete control of what they could see," Park corrected. "We've been preparing for this possibility for 30 years. Did you really think we put all our eggs in one dome?" Over the following hours, HFY learned that his assessment of human military capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. Haven's Rest had not been a single colony clinging to a barren moon. It had been the visible center of a distributed network that included hidden bases in the asteroid field, camouflaged mining operations, and supply caches scattered throughout the system. The battle had not been a desperate last stand. It had been a carefully orchestrated deception, designed to make the hegemony believe they had achieved total victory while the real resistance infrastructure remained intact. "You sacrificed thousands of people as a distraction?" Zeftai asked, struggling to process this revelation. "We sacrificed ourselves to save millions," Park replied. Haven's Rest was home to 12,000 colonists, but we were also the coordination hub for 57 other refugee settlements across the Outer Rim. If the hegemony had discovered our real operation, hundreds of thousands of people would have been enslaved. The captain transmitted a data package that made Zeftai's analytical mind real. The humans had not been running a simple mining colony. They had been operating the largest underground railroad in galactic history, helping refugees escape corporate slavery and establishing hidden settlements beyond the reach of the major powers. Haven's Rest had been the visible tip of an iceberg. Its destruction had been planned, calculated, and accepted as the price of keeping the rest of the network operational. "The people who died in the battle," Zeftai said slowly, "they knew this was the plan?" "Some did. Others suspected. All of them understood that sometimes good people have to die so that other good people can live. That's what courage means, advisor. It's not about being unafraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." Zeftai found himself wanting to understand more. Against every regulation governing his mission, he requested permission to dock with one of the hidden resistance bases. Captain Park agreed, apparently deciding that the Keth observer might be useful. The base was hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid, invisible to sensors and accessible only through a maze of natural passages. As Zeftai's pod was guided through the docking sequence, he marveled at the engineering. The humans had carved out a functional city inside solid rock, complete with living quarters, manufacturing facilities, and defensive systems. Captain Park met him at the airlock. She was younger than he had expected, with a kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in difficult places. Her right arm was cybernetic, a replacement for whatever she had lost in previous battles. "Welcome to Firebase Echo," she said, leading him through corridors lined with busy humans, one of 17 installations the hegemony doesn't know about. The tour that followed challenged every assumption Zeftai had made about human capabilities. The resistance wasn't a ragtag group of survivors clinging to hope. They were a sophisticated military operation with advanced technology, detailed intelligence networks, and strategic thinking that rivaled anything he had seen in his 3 centuries of service. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked as they observed technicians assembling what appeared to be advanced spacecraft. "Since the day we arrived at Haven's Rest," Park replied. "We knew eventually someone would come for us. The galaxy doesn't like free colonies. We've spent 30 years preparing for war." They entered a command center where dozens of humans worked at holographic displays monitoring communications across the galaxy. The scope of the operation was staggering. The Resistance was tracking hegemony fleet movements, coordinating with rebel cells on dozens of worlds, and managing supply lines that stretched across 3 sectors. "This is Commander Torres," Park said, introducing him to a grizzled man with scars covering half his face. "He runs our intelligence division." "Torres, explain to our Keth friend how we've been staying one step ahead of the hegemony." Torres gestured to a display showing fleet positions across local space. "The corporate powers think they understand humans because they see our emotional responses and assume we're irrational. They don't realize that emotional motivation combined with rational planning makes us extremely dangerous." He highlighted a series of red dots on the map. "We've been feeding the hegemony false intelligence for 2 years, making them think our major operations were centered on Haven's Rest. When they finally attacked, they thought they were cutting off the head of the snake. Instead, they fell into a trap that revealed their entire battle doctrine." Zeftai studied the tactical display. "You used your own people as bait. We used volunteers who understood the mission," Torres corrected. "Administrator Chen knew he was signing a death warrant when he refused to surrender. So did every pilot who flew against that battle fleet. They chose to die because their deaths served a larger purpose." The Keth advisor spent days studying the human operation, trying to understand the strategic principles that guided their thinking. What he discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about military science. Traditional galactic warfare was based on resource calculations. Fleets engaged when commanders believed they had sufficient advantage to ensure victory. Territories were conquered when their value exceeded the cost of occupation. Wars ended when one side could no longer afford to continue fighting. Humans operated by different rules. They measured victory not just in terms of resources gained or lost, but in terms of principles upheld and promises kept. They would fight battles they couldn't win if those battles served strategic purposes. They would sacrifice valuable assets to protect people who had no economic value. It was inefficient. It was expensive. It was also incredibly effective. Your people died at Haven's Rest to convince the hegemony that you were weak, Zeftai said to Captain Park during one of their evening discussions. But you're actually stronger than they realize. Strength isn't just about ships and weapons, Park replied. It's about having something worth fighting for. The hegemony fights for profit margins and territorial control. We fight for the right to exist as free beings. Guess which motivation is more powerful? She showed him recordings from other resistance operations. On Kepler Station, human civilians had held off corporate security forces for 6 months using improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics. On New Geneva, a handful of refugees had established a thriving settlement that now housed 50,000 people. On Prosperity, human engineers had developed new technologies that made their world too valuable for the corporations to simply destroy. Each story followed the same pattern. Humans faced with impossible odds would find ways to exceed those odds through creativity, determination, and a willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. They lost individual battles but won larger campaigns by changing the rules of engagement. The galaxy sees us as reckless and emotional, Park explained. They think we make poor decisions because we prioritize individuals over efficiency. What they don't understand is that our strength comes from those individual bonds. When you're fighting for people you care about, you find capabilities you didn't know you had. Zeftai thought of his own species. The Keth had survived by being rational, by calculating odds and choosing the safest path. They had thrived by serving powerful patrons and avoiding unnecessary risks. They were successful, stable, and secure. They were also, he realized, completely dependent on others for their freedom. What happens now? He asked. The hegemony thinks they've won. Your people are in prison ships heading for slave camps. How do you recover from that? Park smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the base, Zeftai saw genuine happiness in her expression. We don't recover, advisor. We advance. Tomorrow night, we launch Operation Exodus. 17 coordinated strikes across 3 sectors. We're going to liberate those prison ships, destroy the hegemony's forward supply bases, and establish 6 new free colonies in territories they thought were secure. She handed him a tactical briefing that made his analytical mind spin. The humans weren't planning a simple rescue operation. They were launching a full-scale offensive designed to cripple hegemony operations across the entire Outer Rim. The scope was breathtaking. The audacity was terrifying. The chance of success by any rational calculation was minimal. You're going to attack the most powerful military force in the galaxy with a handful of converted cargo ships and asteroid miners. We're going to show them that people fighting for freedom are stronger than machines fighting for profit. Park corrected, and we're going to win. That night, as Zeftai lay in the guest quarters the humans had provided, he found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his existence. His mission was complete. He had observed Haven's Rest, assessed its capabilities, and witnessed its destruction. His superiors expected him to return with a full report, but the humans had shown him something his superiors had never mentioned in their briefings: the difference between existing and living, between surviving and thriving, between serving and choosing. Tomorrow, the resistance would launch their impossible offensive. They would fight battles they couldn't win for causes they couldn't abandon. Many of them would die. All of them knew this, and every single one of them would die free. For 3 centuries, Zeftai had served military organizations by calculating odds and predicting outcomes. He had always chosen the safe path, the rational decision, the logical course of action. Tomorrow, for the first time in his life, he was going to have to decide whether he wanted to remain a calculating observer or become something more dangerous and beautiful. Someone who stood for something greater than himself. The battle for Haven's Rest had ended, with the humans apparently defeated. But as Zeftai stared out at the hidden fleet preparing for Operation Exodus, he began to understand that the real war was just beginning. Zeftai stood in the Firebase Echo Command Center, watching the final preparations for Operation Exodus. Around him, humans worked with focused intensity, checking weapon systems, coordinating jump calculations, and saying quiet goodbyes to friends who might not survive the next 24 hours. He had made his decision during the long night hours. When Captain Park approached him that morning, he was ready. "I want to join your operation," he announced. Park studied him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything. "This isn't your fight, advisor. The Keth have always stayed neutral. Why risk that now? Because neutrality isn't actually neutral, Zeftai replied. By staying out of conflicts, my people enable the strong to oppress the weak. We call it pragmatism, but it's really just cowardice dressed up in fancy words. The captain nodded slowly. What can you offer us? Zeftai transmitted his credentials. 3 centuries of military analysis, detailed knowledge of galactic fleet deployments, and most importantly, access to Keth communication networks that could provide real-time intelligence during the operation. Do you understand that if you do this, you can never go back to your old life? Park warned. The consortium won't forgive betrayal. Your own people will consider you a traitor. Then I'll learn to live with new people, Zeftai said. People who taught me what it means to stand for something. The operation launched at 0300 Standard Time. 17 resistance fleets materialized simultaneously across 3 sectors, appearing as if from nowhere to strike at hegemony installations. Zeftai found himself aboard the flagship of Strike Group 7, headed for the prison convoy carrying Haven's Rest survivors. Commander Torres handled tactical coordination while Captain Park led the assault. Zeftai provided intelligence analysis, using his access to consortium networks to track enemy responses and predict fleet movements. What he witnessed over the following hours redefined his understanding of warfare. The humans didn't fight like any military force he had studied. They improvised constantly, adapting their tactics in real time based on changing circumstances. When their primary assault plan failed, they switched to contingency options. When those failed, they invented new strategies on the spot. The Strike Group 7 consisted of 8 converted cargo ships and 2 purpose-built warships that had been constructed in secret over the past decade. They were facing a hegemony convoy protected by 6 heavy cruisers and 24 escort vessels. Any rational commander would have declared the mission impossible and withdrawn. The humans attacked anyway. Their opening move involved 3 cargo ships loaded with mining equipment jumping directly into the convoy's formation. Instead of opening fire, they detonated their cargo holds, filling local space with metallic debris that played havoc with hegemony sensors. While the enemy fleet tried to clear their targeting systems, the resistance warships struck from 2 directions simultaneously. Their weapons were unconventional combinations of mining lasers, plasma cutters, and improvised missile systems, but they were wielded by crews who understood that creativity could overcome firepower. The battle raged for 3 hours. Zeftar watched human commanders make decisions that defied military doctrine. When the flagship's engines were damaged, Captain Park ordered the ship to ram the nearest hegemony cruiser. When their weapons were depleted, Commander Torres had his crew launch life pods loaded with explosives. It was madness. It was the most effective naval combat Zeftai had ever observed. When the smoke cleared, the prison convoy was free. 5,000 humans who had been destined for slave camps were now being evacuated to hidden colonies across the Outer Rim. The cost had been severe. Half the resistance fleet was destroyed, and hundreds of volunteers had died. But the mission was accomplished. Similar scenes played out across all 17 target zones. The resistance lost 60% of their combat vessels and nearly 2,000 personnel. By traditional military calculations, Operation Exodus was a disaster. By human standards, it was a complete victory. Over the following weeks, as the rescued colonists were integrated into the underground network, Zeftai began to understand the true scope of what the resistance had accomplished. They hadn't just freed prisoners. They had demonstrated to the entire galaxy that the hegemony could be beaten. Within days of the operation, resistance cells on 12 corporate worlds launched uprisings. Refugee settlements that had been hiding in the outer systems began openly declaring their independence. 3 minor galactic powers announced they were withdrawing from hegemony trade agreements. The humans had started a revolution. You see now why we don't measure victory the same way other species do, Captain Park explained as they reviewed battle reports from across the galaxy. We're not trying to win individual engagements. We're trying to change the fundamental balance of power. Zeftai studied the strategic assessments his own analytical networks were providing. The hegemony was reacting exactly as the humans had predicted, deploying massive fleets to crush the uprisings. But each show of force created more refugees, and each new wave of refugees strengthened the resistance network. You're using their strength against them, he realized. Every oppressive system contains the seeds of its own destruction, Park replied. You just have to know how to plant them in the right places. The Keth advisor found himself thinking of his own people again. For 3 centuries, the Keth had served as military consultants to various galactic powers, always choosing the side that seemed most likely to win. They had prospered by being useful to the strong and avoiding the attention of their enemies. But they had never been free. They had never chosen their own path or stood for their own principles. They had been successful servants, not independent beings. I want to do more than just provide intelligence, Zeftai announced during a strategy meeting. I want to contact my people, convince them to join the resistance. Torres looked skeptical. The Keth have been neutral for millennia. What makes you think they'll change now? Because neutrality is about to become impossible, Zeftai replied. The hegemony is going to demand that every species choose sides. My people can either stand with freedom or serve tyranny. There won't be a middle ground. Park authorized the mission. Using his personal credentials, Zeftai sent carefully crafted messages to key figures in the Keth government. He shared intelligence about the resistance network, documented evidence of hegemony atrocities, and most importantly, recordings of human courage in action. The response was not what he expected. Instead of outrage or inspiration, he received a formal communication from the Keth High Council declaring him a rogue agent. His citizenship was revoked, his access to clan resources terminated, and a bounty placed on his head. I'm sorry, Park said when the rejection became clear. I know you were hoping they would see the truth. Zeftai was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, an expression that looked strange on his angular features. They did see the truth, he replied. They saw that choosing freedom means giving up the illusion of safety. They're just not ready for that yet. The war that followed lasted 3 standard years. Zeftai participated in dozens of operations, using his analytical skills to help the resistance stay one step ahead of increasingly desperate hegemony responses. He learned to fight alongside humans, to think like humans, to embrace the beautiful madness of choosing principle over pragmatism. He was present at the Battle of New Gettysburg, where a human fleet of converted mining barges held off a hegemony armada for 6 days, buying time for the evacuation of 2 million civilians. He participated in the liberation of the Tau Ceti prison complex, where resistance forces freed 50,000 political prisoners. He helped plan the attack on hegemony headquarters that finally brought down the corporate empire. Throughout it all, he marveled at the humans' capacity to find hope in hopeless situations, to discover strength they didn't know they possessed, to stand together when standing apart would be easier. The final battle took place in orbit around Earth itself. The hegemony's last fleet, desperately trying to break the siege of their home system, faced a combined force of human resistance ships and allied vessels from dozens of species who had finally found the courage to choose freedom. Zeftai commanded a squadron of Keth volunteers who had defected during the war's final months. They were a tiny fraction of his species, but they represented something unprecedented. Keth who had chosen to fight for principles rather than profit. As the battle raged around Earth, Zeftai found himself thinking about the moment that had changed everything. 3 years ago, he had watched humans die for strangers, sacrifice themselves for abstract ideals, choose death over dishonor. At the time, he had thought it was madness. Now, as he led his small squadron against impossible odds, he understood that it had been the sanest thing he had ever witnessed. The hegemony fleet broke and scattered. Corporate headquarters surrendered. Across the galaxy, 1,000 worlds declared their independence from the systems of oppression that had defined galactic civilization for millennia. The war was over. Freedom had won. At the victory celebration on Luna, Zeftai found himself standing beside Captain Park, watching fireworks bloom against the star-filled sky. She had been promoted to admiral during the war and now commanded the largest free fleet in galactic history. Any regrets? She asked. Zeftai thought about the question carefully. He had lost his original identity, his clan connections, his comfortable position in galactic society. He had spent 3 years fighting battles where death was always possible, and victory never guaranteed. He had seen friends die and watched civilizations burn. None, he said finally. You humans taught me something my people never understood. It's better to die standing than to live kneeling. Park smiled. We learned something from you too, you know. All that analytical thinking, all those careful calculations. You showed us that courage is more effective when it's combined with intelligence. Around them, beings from dozens of species celebrated together. Former slaves danced with their liberators. Children who had been born in prison camps played with the children of resistance fighters. The galaxy was free because people had chosen to stand together despite their differences. What happens now? Zeftai asked. Now we build something better, Park replied. We create a galactic society based on cooperation instead of domination. We make sure that freedom isn't just a privilege for the strong. And if new tyrants arise, if other empires try to fill the hegemony's place, Park looked at him with those sharp eyes that had seen through so many deceptions. Then we'll stand against them too. That's what courage means, Zeftai. It's not a single moment of heroism. It's the willingness to keep standing, no matter how often you get knocked down. Years later, when Zeftai wrote his memoirs of the war, he would begin with a simple observation.
Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear.
He had learned this from humans, a species the galaxy had once dismissed as emotional and unpredictable. The galaxy had been wrong about humans in many ways. They were emotional, but that emotion gave them strength. They were unpredictable, but that unpredictability made them dangerous to tyrants. They were willing to die for principles that other species saw as abstractions. Most importantly, they were willing to stand with anyone who shared their commitment to freedom. Regardless of species, origin, or past mistakes, standing with humans, Zeftai had learned what courage truly meant. And in learning that lesson, he had discovered something he had never known he was missing. The knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting seems impossible. In the end, that knowledge had changed not just his own life, but the destiny of the galaxy itself. Sometimes, the most logical thing you can do is choose to hope when hope seems lost, to fight when fighting seems futile, and to stand with others when standing alone would be so much easier. That, he had learned, was the true meaning of courage. And once you understood it, you could never go back to being the person you were before. Only standing with humans did I understand what courage truly means. HFY. HFY Sci-Fi.